Hello students, today we are here to discuss about the projective techniques. All of you know that personality can be measured through various techniques like self-report inventories, observation method, checklists, rating scales, through interview and also through projective techniques. In today's session, we will concentrate on projective techniques, how these projective techniques are useful in understanding the assessment of the personality of an individual. How do they influence us in understanding the individual? How far it is effective using the projective techniques? When I say about the projective techniques, naturally it is different from the self-report inventory. You all know that in a self-report inventory, you yourself are rating yourself on a particular dimension or on a variety of situations. In fact, the self-report inventories are direct measures of personality, whereas projective techniques are indirect measures of personality. If we look at the origin of the projective techniques, they have emerged in the clinical practice, because when they are dealing with the clinical cases, in order to assess their personality, the researchers felt or clinicians felt it is difficult to directly get the information, because most often that may be a biased report or it may be a faked information. So, when we see that the person is not aware about what he is assessed, naturally he tries to be more genuine in giving the responses. So, keeping this into consideration, projective tests were developed. So, before we understand what are these projective techniques, let us see the difference between self-report inventories and projective techniques. In projective techniques, the individual is given an unstructured situation to which the person responds. In unstructured situation means, a situation is given where the meaning of the situation and interpretation of the situation may vary from individual to individual. The most important assumption of projective techniques is, when responding to this unstructured situation, an individual projects his own feelings, needs, motives, etc., without even being aware that he is reflecting all these aspects. Since the individual is not aware of these revelations, he does not resort to any defensive reactions, or he does not resort to any use of defense mechanisms. So, we can say in a projective test, the individual has ample opportunity to project his own personality attributes which are latent and unconscious in the interpretation of an unstructured situation. When latent and concealed, these experiences are incapable of exposure by the questionnaire type of test. So, such kind of latent and concealed experiences are not possible when we are administering an self-report inventory or a questionnaire. On the other hand, projective techniques are using a holistic approach to understanding the personality as a whole. That is, they try to use the global approach. They try to give the overall profile of an individual instead of focusing only on certain traits or part of the personality. For example, if I want to know whether a person is an introvert or extrovert, I may be using only that particular questionnaire. I may be knowing only that aspect of the personality, but I may not get the complete profile of the individual. Similarly, if I want to know whether the person is suffering with any kind of an anxiety or any kind of a depression, the self-report inventory regarding that dimension gives only that important aspect, but I may not be knowing the other aspects of it. But when we use the projective techniques, the overall personality may be exhibited through the responses given by the client. Projective tests are also different from the observational methods. The reason is, in observation method, generally the observer can be more biased, because in most of the cases the observer may be knowing whom he is observing, or sometimes even if the person is not known, that is, the person who is observed is not known, but still the observer may use his own subjective bias. This is not possible in the projective tests. Now, let us see the classification of projective techniques. Number of classifications have given by different researchers and personality psychologists, but the first basic classification and the classic classification of projective techniques is given by Frank. His classification of projective techniques is based mainly upon the nature of response evoked by the materials of projective techniques. Now, let us see how Frank has classified the projective techniques. The first classification is they are constitutive, that is projective techniques are constitutive. This category of projective techniques includes all those situations in which the examinee constitutes or frames structures upon the materials which are unstructured. For example, finger painting, drawing completion are the best examples. According to Zubin, Iran and Skumer, the Rorschach test also falls in this category because the examinee imposes his or her own responses upon the unstructured ink blots. Another important category is constructive. The constructive category of projective techniques are similar to the constituent category, but this category includes all those situations where the examinee is required to structure a particular task, that is to construct a specific task. The examinee is required to impose a structure upon the situation in the direction specified by the examiner, that is instructions are given to the examinee. Based upon that, the examinee has to develop a construct, that is take up a task, build up a task. For example, the examinee may be asked to draw a figure of a human male or a female, and this would be included in the constructive category rather than in the constitutive category, because drawing according to the examinee's own wish or desire is done. So, we can say in the constitutive category test, situations allow a free expression of the examinee's fantasies, imaginations, desires and wishes, whereas in the constructive category test situations do not give such permission. Another important classification of projective techniques is interpretative. Some tests are constitutive, some tests are constructive, while other tests are interpretive. In these situations, that is in this category, certain test situations are given to the examinee where they have to add a meaning to the situation. For example, we can say TAT, that is thematic apperception test, comes under this category, where the examinee is shown a picture and the person is asked to interpret the situation. What is happening in the scene, what should have happened, what would have happened, what may happen. So, here preceding things, the present situations and the consequences are asked by the examinee. So, we can say this is an interpretative test. Another important classification is refractive, that is it includes all those techniques through which the examinee is given an opportunity to express his personality in the form of painting or handwriting. We can say graphology has been cited by Frank as the best example of this category. It is quite common, we might have seen how graphology has become very popular, and even most of the people are interested to show their handwriting and get it interpreted to know about their own personality. So, to what extent graphology is really indicating the true personalities? Again, there are some exceptions, but still this handwriting, that is graphology or painting, all these things reveal a lot about the nature of the personality of the individual. Another important classification is cathartic. This category includes those situations where the examinee is given an opportunity to release all the conflicts that the person experiences by manipulating a certain task. For example, we can say play techniques are the best example. When we use this play technique, especially with the children, if a child is suffering a psychological problem or developed a personality disorder because of some physical abuse or emotional abuse or sexual abuse, when the child is not able to express it, by using this play technique, we can understand the conflict or the emotional feelings that the child is undergoing. Based upon that, we can reveal or we can interpret, we can infer what the child is undergoing. However, when we look at this Frank's classification, more than the benefits, there are also the limitations. To what extent we can really follow the classification is one question that has been raised by the critics. One biggest limitation is his classification overlaps so much that we can fit one particular technique in more than one category. For example, a figure drawing test may be included in the constitutive category or constructive category or refractive category. So, Frank's classification is not a widely accepted classification of the projective tests. There is another classification given by Lindsay, and this was most convincing classification of projective techniques. Based upon the responses of the examinees, Lindsay has divided projective techniques into 5 categories. The first classification is association techniques. It is quite natural that we tend to interpret the situations by associating certain things. So, this association technique category includes those situations where the examinee is required to respond with the associations which are evoked in his mind when he is given the situation and the task. For example, the Rorschach test, the Holzman's ink blot test and word association tests are the best example that fit into this category. The Rorschach test requires the examinees to respond to an unstructured situation. That is, here the ink blots are given which look in different forms, and when the examinee is interpreting these ink blots, he might be associating certain objects, certain persons or events. However, no attempt is made to mold these associations either by the examinee or by the examiner. Similarly, in the word association test, a word is given to the examinee and he or she has to respond immediately to that word, that is, whatever comes to his mind, he has to say it aloud. For example, if I say bread, the answer could be butter or the answer could be hungry. When I say knife, it could be cutting the vegetable. Another response could be killing the person. So, immediately without much thinking, how the examinee responds to a word that is given, that is, the response of the person indicates a lot about the personality of the individual. So, we say like how the association of ideas is taking place in the individual and how they are relating the unstructured events or situations, or how they are trying to see the association between the words. And when we are using this word association test, the responses of the reaction time is also analyzed. For how many words, how much time is taken, for what sort of words the reaction time is more. All these things also reveal a lot about the personality of the individual. Another classification given by Lindsay is construction techniques. In this particular classification, a situation is given where the examinee has to construct a story after seeing the stimulus materials with a certain specified time. No record is generally kept about the time, but the examinee's themes and mode of explaining or responding are more relevant in understanding the personality of the individual. We can say thematic apperception test, children's apperception test, Rosenwig picture frustration test are the best examples that come under this category. In fact, even object relations technique can also fit into this category. In all these tests, the examinee is asked to construct a story or produce a simple statement or a response in the form of a reaction to the situation that is given to the examinee. Another important classification of projective techniques is completion techniques. These techniques reveal a lot about the true nature of the personality of the individual. In this category, the examinee is presented an incomplete sentence and the examinee is asked to complete them in any way he desires. There are no conditions, uses of the words, or no conditions about the particular mode of response. For example, sentences like I feel tense because. So, the statement has to be completed by the examinee. My ambition in life is dash. So, what comes to the mind of the examinee, they have to write down that. I often get nervous when dash. So, this incomplete statement has to be completed by the examinee, and the person is asked not to think too much about the reasoning and then responding to the sentences. Whatever comes to their mind, once they read the sentence, they have to fill it. Once the responses are given by the examinee, they are analyzed and interpreted to get some clue regarding his personality. However, we can say these techniques lack a uniform and structured mode of analysis. Stories were also used as a completion technique. The outline of the story will be given and they have to cook up the story using that outline. Another classification is expressive techniques. In this particular category of the situations, the examinee expresses his personality through some manipulative tasks which generally involve some interaction with the material. Once again, we can say here play, drawing, role playing, painting, finger painting, all these things are the common expressive techniques. One important feature of expressive techniques is examiner pays much attention to the way or process by which the examinee is manipulating the given material. For example, we may ask the examinee to play with a toy. He may pay attention to the process by which dolls are selected and handled during the play. For example, a child showing or developing hostility towards a teacher may pick up a doll which looks like a teacher, and the child may be abusing the doll or may be trying to behave in an aggressive way with the doll. This indicates the kind of the ventilation that the child is revealing about his or her feelings towards the teacher. That is, hostility has come out by using the dolls. So, in the expressive techniques, attention is given to the process and not the end product of the process. We can say expressive techniques are different from construction techniques because the emphasis is given to the process, whereas process and the way the materials are handled rather than the end product of the process. That is, focusing on how the story is developed or what is the story or what is the content of the theme. The famous toy world test is an example of expressive technique. Another classification of projective tests is choice techniques. In this particular category, also known as ordering techniques category, we can say like it is more towards developing the objectivity of the projective tests, unlike the other projective tests. The examinee is presented with some sets of pictures or items, and the instruction is to choose the most relevant and appropriate picture. Sometimes the examinee may be asked to rank these items or pictures in terms of his preference and or the name ordering of the techniques. Sometimes the examinee may be asked to rank those pictures in terms of his preference. That is the reason why the name called as ordering technique. In this particular category, we can also use the multiple choice items because from that we can infer what the child's personality is. Choice techniques are more like in multiple choice items because the child is or the examinee is preferring what he wants. Based upon that, we can infer the personality of the individual. The Zondi test is an example of choice technique because the examinees are required to rank sets of pictures along a like and dislike dimension or continuum. Another important classification given by Best is another important classification of projective techniques, and he proposed here 4 different ways of classification. The first classification the Best used is association technique. Here the examinee is presented with test situations like pictures, ink blots, cartoons, and the examinee is asked to tell what he feels, what he sees, what he thinks. The Rorschach test, the Holzmann ink blot test and the word association test belong to this category. Best also gave the classification of projective techniques as completion techniques. Once again, here the incomplete sentences are presented to the examinee who completes them in the way they like. These tests, that is incomplete sentences tests, are found to be useful in interpreting traits like anxieties, guilt feelings, hostility, aggression, attitudes towards sexuality, paranoid tendencies, etc. So, most of the abnormal behavior patterns can be inferred by using this incomplete sentences test. For example, some items may be showing the paranoid tendencies like somebody is always trying me dash. So, they will put forward the idea of how he is feeling. I always worry about, so that gap has to be filled in. I think that my body is. So, if a person has a distorted self image of his own body, naturally he would be responding in a negative way. Role playing is another classification given by BEST. Here the examinee is asked to play a specific role in a group. The group may be having 2 or more individuals, and this role play continues for a specified period of time. When you ask an examinee to play a certain role, sometimes certain surprising things may come up which he may never have said to anyone earlier. His sayings reveal, that is, his role plays and his verbal discussions as a part of the role play reveal his motives, his intentions, needs, attitudes, etc. Naturally, this role playing technique will help us to identify traits like anger, hostility, frustration, dominance and authoritarianism. Creative or constructive technique is another important classification. This technique involves again playing with dolls or finger paint, drawing a figure. Sometimes BEST asks the examinee to write some imaginative story about some assigned situations. We can say TAT can be included because BEST also use this kind of a technique. Generally, on the basis of the choice of the colors, choice of the words, the formation of the sentences, the order of the sentences, all these things help us to infer the true nature of the personality of the individual. One way to reduce the confusion and overlapping in the classification of projective techniques is to classify them as 3 categories, that is pictorial techniques, verbal techniques and expressive techniques. Because there are too many classifications given by too many people, that may be creating a confusion. So, ultimately they said we can classify all the projective techniques as 3 things, that is pictorial, verbal and expressive. Under the pictorial techniques, from whatever we have discussed earlier, we can say Rorschach test can fit into this, TAT can fit into this, CAT, children's apperception test can come under this category, and Rosenwick picture frustration test can also be included in this category. So, where a picture is given and the person is asked to interpret, all such variety of techniques can be a part of this pictorial technique. Verbal technique. In this verbal technique, probably we can say incomplete sentences test can be used, because the examinee has to respond to the situation. When the examiner says a word, the examinee has to utter whatever comes to his mind. So, incomplete sentences can be a verbal technique. So, word association can be a part of the verbal technique of projective tests. Then under the third category, that is expressive, we can say all the tasks where the persons are asked to manipulate the things and then present the picture or complete the task can come under this category. So, here graphology, painting, role playing, playing with dolls, all these things can be included under this category. Here in the expressive technique, the way or the manner in which the examinee is looking at the situation or looking at the object and how he is using these kind of the objects or the situations helps us to assess his personality. So, these are the different classifications, but finally we have concluded as under 3 categories. Though we say projective techniques are different from the other assessment techniques of personality, and we say that they provide a more objective basis for assessing the personality of the individual, it has its own limitations. Many people criticized, that is many researchers, many clinicians criticized that it has its own limitations. It is very difficult to assess the reliability of these tests, because when we administer these projective tests, how I understand an examinee's response to a situation or a role playing or a finger painting may be different from how the other person interprets or infers the situation. So, naturally Though we say it is more towards the objective approach of assessment of personality, there is a subjective element or subjective bias involved in that, and it is also difficult to establish the reliability and validity of the projective tests. However, despite these limitations, we can say projective techniques are still very popular in clinical situations, especially in understanding the clinically disturbed patients and patients with severe personality disorders.